Hello, welcome back. If you found this video, I'm posted it under transition, and this is the last longer video about going from survival mode to intentional living. And I'm so glad you're here. We're going to have an in-depth discussion. It's going to require more than just a little short. Okay, so when we get to this point of transition and moving into intentional living, after this we have some awareness. We start seeing some patterns and we begin to release those patterns and we start to imagine our life as being something else. Here's a moment where life brings you back to being able to do something very practical. It's not a theory. All right, it's not just a reflection and it's not like just a vision, but it's a question that shows up in the middle of your ordinary life. So what do I do now? We want to live intentionally, right? We know that we're in survival mode. We've moved through letting go, the release. What do I actually do now? And this is where many people kind of hesitate. So if nothing big is happening yet, does that mean that nothing is happening at all? Like if we're in that transition stage and we're not seeing any big divine revelation, not big change or shift, where are we? Is something going to happen at all? Okay, but intentional living, it doesn't begin with like really big changes. It begins with small actions, small steps that come from a different place inside you. Okay, so the first thing I want to say is taking action doesn't mean that you're going to be doing a big overhaul of your life. You don't have to change everything. You don't have to like start canceling people, change your job, move to a different city. You don't have to do all that. It doesn't mean you have to overhaul your whole life. That's one of the biggest misunderstandings about change. It's the idea that it has to be really dramatic, like everybody's going to notice, like, wow, what a change in this person, or otherwise it hasn't happened at all. Survival patterns, they don't shift through force, but they shift through repetition of small, different choices. And you know what I'm going to tell you? Most of the choices are choosing yourself and your health and your well-being and things like that. But you already probably know that for sure. But not everything has to be rebuilt from scratch. Some of the things that we've been doing got us to where we are now, and they're purposeful and they work. But some of the things, we just have to have a repattern or like a shift. So I want to talk about now the power of small interruptions. Intentional living begins with eruptions, not a volcano, interruptions, but they're gentle, they're not harsh. We're going to talk about 4 things that this might look like. It might look like we pause before we automatically say yes to things. Maybe it means that we're really utilizing some grounding and taking some deep breaths before we respond to things. We're just kind of slowing it down. And then also could be just our mental questioning that we do that says, do I actually want this? Like before we make choices, something I want before we commit to things. There's no rushing and like impulsive kind of grabbing at things. Even if it looks like an opportunity, we take the time to really kind of think it through. And we choose not to rush, especially when it's pretty proven that there's no real sense of urgency. There's no need to just kind of rush into things. And these could be very different decisions that we've done in the past. And this is where the big change really begins. We start replacing, those big reactive things that we've been doing into a sense of awareness. So survival mode often runs on reaction, and that's kind of our old patterns. We respond very quickly. We want things to be resolved immediately, all right? We want things to keep moving. And we don't pause too long. And, I have an expression, if you know me, sometimes I say that, people have the patience of a flea or the attention span of a flea. We want what we want and we want it now. Intentional living kind of puts that aside. That's not something that we're doing anymore. Intentional living introduces us to the pause. So that doesn't mean we're delaying life or that we're being indecisive. And it might seem small to other people that we're taking the time to kind of saying, I'll think about it, I'll get back to you. But internally, this changes your relationship with yourself. It really does. When you start doing this, you don't have to do it perfectly. There's no you got to get it right. there'll be days sometimes when you slip back to kind of maybe responding impulsively if that's what you've been doing, or feeling kind of that panic. But there'll days when you notice this, that you're doing it a different way. And when you become aware of this, you'll realize there's days when you do it and days you don't. And hopefully the days where you do take a pause and kind of think about things will start to become a pattern. And these are the patterns that you'll fall back into. Just repetition is really big. They say it takes 21 days to develop a new habit. I really do believe that's true. So we're not trying to totally push our old way of doing things out. We're trying to develop new habits, and we're trying to eliminate the survival mode that we were in. Might not happen overnight, but repetition and trying to develop a new pattern is going to be what gets us into intentional living. And we learn often these patterns that we are in to kind of step out of them more often than we're staying in them. So the next thing I want to talk about is what changes over time. You start trusting your own pauses, and you know that even if you're uncomfortable, once you get used to it, you know that that's really going to help you out in doing the right thing for yourself. And you start noticing and getting to know yourself. You know your preferences. All right, you get a self-knowing, a self-awareness, and you start feeling less pressure and like you have to make a decision right now. That pressure seems to lift. And then you get to feel more like you're more present in your own life, right? That you're the driver of your own life. Nothing feels loud like it did before, or that it's demanding that you have to do something right now. And your internal experiences, that's when they begin to reorganize, and you realize that internal shift, it matters more than speed. Okay, so this is how change actually happens. All right, intentional living is not built on a whole bunch of breakthroughs. That's what you probably thought. In the past, I'm sure that when you've worked with other people, and if you've heard people that are coaches like myself, or dare I say therapists or gurus or whatever, they make it sound like it's going to be some divine revelation, a big breakthrough, but it's actually built out of small moments, small ones, repeating, and sometimes just things that we barely even notice. And over time they accumulate and they build up into something that's very different. It doesn't happen overnight again, but it's a different way of being in your own life, and it's that shift that begins to carry you and give you forward momentum. So now I want to go back and talk a little bit about transition, because that's what the name of this video is. And this transitioning is kind of the final step to intentional living. So the next and final step that we begin exploring is, this is a new way of being, all right? It starts to feel a healthful part of your identity. It's not just something you're trying to do, but something that you're beginning to live. You're beginning to embody it, because eventually this action becomes part of you, and that really does change everything. So this begins to have an identity shift about who you are, how you feel, and your awareness. You become the version of yourself that actually begins to live this way, who begins to live intentionally. So there comes a point in this process when something happens. It's not like this breakthrough moment, like I said. It's not like a big oh, okay. It could be something that's more subtle. And you start noticing that you're no longer trying to live differently. You actually are living differently. You're not living a perfect life, but in ways you're changing, and that's not easy to ignore, that you're having those changes. It's when it stops being something that you're doing and starts becoming more about who you're becoming, being, and something that you're living. All right, so it starts to not be so much about productivity and what you're producing, right, and more about your value is who you are and who you're being. Okay, so at this point you stop asking, how do I do this? In the beginning of change, there's always questions like, how do I stop repeating the old patterns that I have? How do I stay consistent with this? How do I fix these patterns? Over time, these questions begin to shift, not because that everything is all solved, like you got to solve everything at once. It's because you start to stabilize. So instead of asking, how do I do this? You begin to notice that you already are. I'm going to repeat that. You stop asking, how am I going to be able to do this? How am I going to shift from survival mode and more intentional living? After a while, you stop asking that question. You really realize that you already actually are. Dorothy, you are already home, all right? You're not looking for some type of, masterful change or something that's going to be explosive. You realize that you already are actually living that. And your identity as person who's intentional living, it doesn't something that happens all at once. It's not a shift that's going to happen all in one moment. I'm going to say it again. It's repetitious steps, making different choices, right? You get to learn that your choices and that you're capable. It stops feeling like practice at this point, and it starts feeling like this is your preference. You make preferences according to what you feel fits you and what's in your own best interest. And it's not because you're doing this because everything becomes like easy peasy, lemon squeezy. It doesn't become easy. It's because it feels like it's more you, all right? And at this point in the transition, you start to feel the difference internally within yourself. So this shift becomes more internal before it becomes visible. You feel it, it's inside before anybody else can notice that you're living intentionally. So you might feel that you pause more readily. It becomes more natural to you. You realize that when there is a survival mode behavior, you can name it like that. There's power in naming something for what it is. You recover more once you slide back into these things, like rushing to make a snap decision, or you're doing things that is more like your survival mode behavior. You recognize it, you recover, and you can go back into living more intentionally. You don't stay stuck in that for a long period of time. And you start to know yourself, and you don't feel as confused about your own reactions for things. You get to know yourself and say, Laura, that's really just how you're going to feel about that. It's normal. It's part of who you are, and you don't feel confused about it. And your relationship with yourself, that begins to change, and that becomes like shifts in identity in motion. Okay, so you normally, at this stage in transitioning to intentional living, you stop being so reactive to everything in your life. You stop feeling like everything is happening to you and that you're just somebody who's watching, like an outside watcher, a spectator in your own life. Okay, because survival mode is what's reactive. Intentional living, right, is more of a choice. You get to choose what you want in your life. So this identity shift happens when it becomes more of looking at what's available into your transition to who you're becoming, more than just a reaction to things that are happening. You're still human. You're still going to have difficult days. There's going to be times where you still feel overwhelmed. That's a natural human experience, feeling overwhelmed, like maybe you feel like you bit off more than you can chew. But now there's a gap, it's not a big gap, but you have a gap in between what happens and how you respond to it. And it's in that space where you begin to meet yourself and feel differently about your life and about yourself. You start having what I call a quiet recognition. So you begin to notice something surprising. You no longer are only just thinking about stuff. You start saying things like, these are the types of things that you'll notice in your pattern of thinking. If you're self-aware and you have like some metacognizance, I'm not saying this right, metacognizance of your self-awareness of your own thinking, you say to yourself, I want to live differently. All right. This is how I live now more often than not. You realize I am not perfect, right? Things are not permanent, but it's consistent enough for how you're living your life intentionally that it really matters. It's a very powerful shift, and it's not something where you feel like everything needs to be fixed, like you need to have every little aspect of your life to be moved over to intentional living. But it's when something, when something new shifts, it starts to feel like that's normal, like change starts to feel normal. This is the real transformation. Okay, intentional living was never about becoming a different person. It was about returning to yourself. It was about getting rid of the constant weight of survival patterns that shape our every decision, And what we start to realize is that you were never trying to become someone new, like an entirely different person. You were always trying to become who you were meant to be. So there was no need to abandon yourselves in ways that you didn't even realize. And over time, that really changes everything, right? That you're not trying to become somebody else or even who you thought you were supposed to be, because life isn't perfect, but you no longer are absent in your own life. Okay, so take a little pause, because this is going to be the end of moving from survival mode to intentional living. And I want to talk a little bit about, for the closing, that you are now intentional living. You're an own active participant in your own life. And this is not the end of the process. This is just the beginning of this. And your identity never really begins shifting. You're always constantly going to changes, and it can unfold in real time. It could be happening every day, sometimes noticeable to us and sometimes not. And sometimes it's noticeable to other people and many times not really. The shift isn't something that is like really, we think of transformative, we think of something that's like going to be bold and kind of explode in front of everyone, and it's going to be something that's like, wow, you've really changed. But it starts to unfold in real time, and you live, you choose, you notice, and then you return to yourself. And now you have a language for it. You're able to name the things that you go through. And when you name things, you have awareness, and you begin practicing intentional living. I hope you enjoyed this series, and I hope it's helpful to you. These videos are going to be available if you missed any and you're not really sure at the end of this video kind of the process and what we're talking about. Feel free to go back and watch the video series. It starts with survival mode. It goes through letting go, the release, and then moves into this last part where we talk about going from transition and entering intentional living. I hope you enjoyed this series. Be sure to like and subscribe. I would love to hear your comments on your thoughts on this video series. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you start living a fully intentional life filled with happiness, peace, and joy.